You were standing on a rain-slicked Manhattan sidewalk in early October 1929, wrapped in a thick wool overcoat, while the cool autumn breeze hums through the stone canyons of Wall Street. All around you, the city feels electrifyingly alive, pulsing with an almost feverish momentum. Radios blare upbeat jazz from third-story apartment windows, newly minted Fords rumble down freshly paved avenues, and vibrant neon signs flicker against the falling dusk. Everyone from elevator operators to retired clerks is talking about the stock market. You feel a sudden, involuntary pulse of anxiety in your chest, a quiet whisper asking if this endless financial velocity can really last forever. But then you look up at the morning newspaper on a newsstand, where Yale economist Irving Fisher has just issued a definitive verdict that calms every lingering doubt. Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. Irving Fisher was a Yale professor and world-renowned statistician who had spent decades cataloging price indexes and national wealth. Looking at America in 1929, Fisher saw assembly lines doubling manufacturing efficiency and electrification reaching 20 million homes. To a data-driven mind of that era, these industrial milestones suggested that the American economy had reached a state of perpetual expansion. While Manhattan hummed with activity, the rural landscape was starting to look different. Crop prices were falling, and small-town banks were closing their doors at a rate of nearly one per day. In the city, household debt was climbing, and textile mills in the South were quietly winding down operations. To a passerby on Wall Street, these events appeared to be isolated friction, the routine cost of progress. The prosperity of the era was so loud that the creaking of distant floorboards sounded like nothing more than background noise. Each warning sign appeared manageable and localized. Farmers were struggling with collapsing prices, but agriculture had always been volatile. Household debt was climbing, but credit looked like the engine of middle-class abundance. Local banks were failing, but small bank closures were an accepted feature of rural life. The essential historical question is why so many brilliant, well-informed leaders failed to imagine the scale of the breakdown before it arrived. People failed to see the Great Depression coming because they were mentally trapped inside the comfortable assumptions of the Roaring Twenties. They believed modern corporate management had tamed the old business cycle forever. They believed the newly created Federal Reserve had eliminated systemic financial panics. When an economic system accelerates, confidence shifts its internal structure. At first, confidence is merely hope, a tentative bet on tomorrow's harvest. Then it becomes habit, a quiet expectation that tomorrow will resemble today. Finally, it becomes evidence, a rigid proof that old limits no longer apply. When confidence becomes evidence, skepticism is treated as a moral failing. Resisting that momentum felt like standing in front of a speeding train. Beneath this glittering surface, the domestic market was reaching a silent saturation point. By 1928, working-class wages had failed to keep pace with the surge in industrial output. Corporations were producing consumer goods faster than ordinary citizens could afford to purchase them out of current income. To bridge this growing gap between production and purchasing power, financial institutions engineered installment credit programs. Imagine walking through a bustling 1920s department store. You don't have $300 in cash to purchase a mahogany radio console today, but a smiling salesman whispers that for just $5 down, you can carry the music of the world into your living room tonight. This created a dangerous illusion of limitless consumer demand. Wealth accumulation was concentrated in a narrow segment of the population. The top 1% of American households received nearly 15% of national income, while the bottom 60% earned barely enough to meet basic living expenses. This top-heavy concentration channeled capital into speculative financial markets rather than broad consumer spending, turning the stock market into a highly sensitive, inflated balloon. The practice of buying stocks on margin accelerated this euphoria into madness. A speculator could put down as little as 10% in cash, borrowing the remaining 90% from a stockbroker. As long as stock prices continued their upward trajectory, leverage amplified modest gains into spectacular fortunes. Leverage is financial enthusiasm with a hidden fuse. It elevates human ego while price is climb. It demands immediate blood the instant prices drop. Installment credit shares this flaw. It works brilliantly as long as your paycheck arrives every Friday on schedule, but it becomes a tightening vice the moment the factory line slows down. When the balloon finally popped in October 1929, it wiped out speculative paper wealth and shattered the fragile psychological foundation that held the consumer economy together. Brokers issued immediate margin calls. As prices fell on Black Thursday and Black Tuesday, millions of forced margin calls flooded the trading floor with sell orders, pushing prices even lower. The trading floor's ticker machines couldn't keep pace with the sheer volume of sell orders, trailing hours behind the actual prices. In the vacuum of information, millions of individual investors made the same split-second decision: sell everything before the price drops further. This was a rational impulse for one person, but when executed by a crowd, it turned into an inescapable avalanche. The psychological mechanism driving institutional blindness in the aftermath is known as normalcy bias. When individuals encounter a novel threat, their brains automatically filter it through past experience. Business leaders assumed they were witnessing another routine business cycle adjustment. Similar to the sharp post-war depression of 1920 to 1921, they trusted the market would find its footing. Imagine a sprawling, multi-story industrial factory. In the executive office upstairs, managers sit at mahogany desks, monitoring a single glowing pressure gauge mounted on the wall. The gauge reads perfectly stable. Down in the basement, away from the manager's view, high-pressure steam pipes are hair-cracked. The managers believe that because the central gauge is steady, the machinery is healthy. They do not realize that the basement pipes are about to explode. Human minds naturally focus on isolated events. A stock market crash is an event. A bank run is also an event. A Great Depression is a self-reinforcing sequence that transforms into an unstoppable machine. Consider the agricultural crisis plaguing the American Midwest. During World War I, farmers took out heavy bank mortgages to buy land. When global grain prices collapsed by over 50% in the 1920s, individual farmers responded by planting even more crops to make up for lower prices. Flooding the market drove prices down further. What made sense for an individual farmer trying to pay his mortgage destroyed the entire agricultural economy. By 1928, thousands of rural banks were insolvent. Urban bankers on Wall Street dismissed these failures as irrelevant local friction. They failed to realize that rural banks were integrated into the national credit network. When rural banks failed, they withdrew their reserve deposits from larger correspondent banks in Chicago and New York, quietly draining liquidity from the central banking system long before the stock market crashed. This chart shows the math of debt deflation. Imagine a small farmer in Iowa with a $10,000 mortgage. In 1928, corn sold for 80 cents a bushel. By 1932, wholesale prices have collapsed to less than 20 cents a bushel. To pay the exact same $10,000 debt, he now has to grow 50,000 bushel of corn. The debt remains fixed while his income vanishes into thin air. Economist Irving Fisher formulated the debt deflation theory of Great Depressions to explain this mechanic. He demonstrated that when over-indebted individuals and firms are forced to liquidate assets simultaneously to pay off debts, their actions flood markets, pushing prices down even faster. The harder debtors work to pay off what they owe by selling assets, the more prices drop. The remaining debt becomes heavier in real terms. The governing institutions of the era actively worsened the spiral. The Federal Reserve's leadership clung to the real bills doctrine, refusing to expand the money supply. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon advocated a liquidationist policy, arguing to liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate farmers. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. Mellon and the liquidationists failed to realize that when you liquidate everything simultaneously, you destroy the foundation of society. By allowing thousands of solvent banks to fail simply because they lacked immediate cash reserves, the Federal Reserve allowed the money supply of the United States to contract by over 1/3 between 1929 and 1933. Modern industrial capitalism cannot survive without liquid credit and public confidence. This vicious feedback loop was magnified by international economic nationalism. American politicians attempted to protect domestic industries by passing the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. A tariff acts like an armoring shield. If every nation raises an armoring shield simultaneously, the global economy transforms into a dark room full of locked doors. Retaliatory tariffs froze commerce and world trade collapsed by over 60%. President Herbert Hoover found himself trapped in a tragedy of institutional philosophy, committed to voluntary cooperation and balanced federal budgets. He urged corporate leaders to voluntarily maintain wages and encouraged local charities to expand soup kitchens. Hoover tried to repair a collapsed foundation with tools built for a minor maintenance job. Local private charities and municipal governments were completely overwhelmed within months. Before the creation of federal deposit insurance, a bank run was a rational exercise in self-preservation. If you heard a rumor that your local bank was short on cash, you did not stop to analyze the bank's long-term solvency. You ran to the bank immediately to withdraw your life savings in physical cash. If you arrived 2 hours late, your money vanished forever. The moment depositors sensed danger, their individual rational impulse to protect their families triggered the precise collective panic that destroyed the bank. Starting in late 1930, waves of banking panic swept across the American heartland. Mass public terror paralyzed the remaining thousands of independent commercial banks, wiping out the accumulated savings of an entire generation. You cannot talk people out of systemic fear when their daily physical reality confirms that the floor is giving way. Treating the crisis as a temporary panic of confidence rather than a structural failure of purchasing power made calls for voluntary restraint sound like cold government abandonment. Recovery only became possible when leadership abandoned the old orthodoxies and implemented structural guarantees. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office in March 1933, he immediately declared a national bank holiday, shutting down every bank to halt the panic runs. He backed his words with structural changes, taking the nation off the rigid gold standard and establishing the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Once depositors knew their savings were guaranteed by the federal government, the psychological impulse to run to the bank vanished overnight. The architects of the 1920s treated the economy like a static mechanical clock. They believed that as long as the surface gears were turning fast, the system was invincible. But human society is a vast, delicate garden. It relies on hidden networks and organic flexibility. A gardener who becomes obsessed with trimming every hedge into perfect, rigid geometric lines will inevitably watch the garden wither from the roots up. The ultimate lesson of the Great Depression is that prosperity is active, continuous coordination based on shared structural trust. Millions of total strangers must trust one another every single day to deposit savings, extend credit, hire workers, and purchase products. When trust breaks down, everything that once appeared solid reveals itself to be fragile and conditional. To be completely honest with you, I have caught myself falling into this exact psychological trap in my own life. A few years ago, I began noticing subtle warning signs in my health and work. Small red flags were waving right in front of me, but I quietly rationalized every single one of them. I clung to the comfortable narrative of momentum, because admitting that the underlying structure was breaking down was too terrifying to face. We treat warning signs as minor inconveniences because confronting systemic failure requires more courage than our ego can spare. When we look at the leaders of 1929, we are looking into a mirror, reflecting our own human frailty. The institutional traps they built were simply magnified versions of our individual self-deceptions.